Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? I hope everybody's having a great time. I hope your life is good. I hope everything is fine with it. I hope the comic book fields are bounteous and you have a lot of subject matter to read and enjoy and collect. My name is Bill, and this is Billboard Comics, and this is another installment of my segment, Growing Up Comics, where I cover basically the stuff that influenced me as I was growing up as a comic book reader first, a comic book collector second, from the 1970s to the present day. Today I'm going to do another listicle, something a little bit different. I've done one or two of these in the past. I might do more in the future. I might do one inspired by this, but I'll wait till the end of the main meat of the article to tell you about this. This is my top 10 artist replacements in comic books from during my lifetime, sort of. What does this mean? Well, basically, comic books are based on legendary creative teams. Lee and Kirby, Lee and Ditko, Claremont and Byrne, Wolfman and Perez, Bendis and Maleev, Kirkman and Otley. A combination of Bendis and Bagley. A combination of writer and artist that come together and create a perfect synergy for a book. It's absolutely perfect in every single way, and it rises the content of the writing and the artwork to a historic level. It becomes more than just a good comic book, it becomes legendary. However, not every creator stays with every book for the entire run of the book. Hardly any of them do. Sometimes some starts off with a big splash, with a big synergistic relationship with the artist, and the artist goes off to greener pastures, or gets tired of doing stuff, or decides to change jobs, or is needed on another book to try to help the sales on that one. So the synergy between the two great creators is fractured and broken, and a lot of the continued success of the book relies on how the replacement fills in. It's not always a great fit, but here are 10 examples of stuff where the superstar great artist left the book and then was replaced by somebody who was as good, or if not better, depending on your opinion on the character. I'm going to begin with number 10, which is the Swamp Thing book. On Swamp Thing number 61, Rick Veitch replaces Stephen R. Bissette as artwork on the book. Alan Moore, of course, was the main driving creator through this period of Swamp Thing. His work on the character revitalized the character, revitalized comic books as it is, gave us the whole grim and gritty trend by people who didn't know exactly what made things grim or gritty, and he provided some of the best horror stories ever made. But he didn't do it alone. He did a lot of it with a partnership of Stephen R. Bissette, whose rich, earthy kind of pencils helped bring the rich, earthy Swamp Thing to life, and the horror, and the blood, and the gore, and the weirdness, all together on page and stuff it is. He helped create a mood for the book that was a perfect home for Moore's writing. So when he left the book, it was kind of weird to have that there might be somebody who might not come in and not be able to have the same kind of thing. It didn't really miss a beat with Rick Veitch, who had a similar style, although somewhat less detailed and atmospheric than Bissette. He was a very fine draftsman, a very good storyteller, and was able to not only take over for Bissette, but eventually would take over as writer and replace Moore on the book as well, and did fairly well on that aspect. It was a swap that could have killed the book, killed all the momentum it had, and might not be still talking about today if it didn't, but it was able to make the book even more legendary and build on what already happened, and has become one of the legendary books of comic book history. Next up, Number 9, John Bogdanove replaces June Brigman on Power Pack, starting with number 22. And just to let you know about this stuff like this, you might see stuff that there's like a gap in numbers here. I'm going with the next regular artist. Sometimes when the regime changes and an artist leaves, sometimes it's not done with forethought or planning. Sometimes it happens in a blink of an eye, and the editors are left trying to figure out stuff, and there's fill-in issues done by other artists before the next regular artist comes in. I'm still going to count those as replacements. I'm not counting the fill-ins as being official replacements because they're only there to take up space until the new guy comes in, and therefore and forthwith. So you might see like a little bit like the main artist leaves on issue 12, the new guy comes in issue 15, and there's stuff in between there. Just so you know, just so you're prepared for that. And if you have any questions with it or issues with it, take it up with me in the comments. Take me behind the woodshed then and let me know how bad I was. So, John Bogdanove, a lot of people have a very controversial opinion of his artwork. I personally like it, but it is very loose. It's somewhat cartoony and somewhat kind of exaggerated. People have been critical of his work on Superman when it was over there. I think he also worked with Louise Simonson on that title as he did here, because it seemed to be like kind of a more cartoony take on the Superman character that it really didn't deserve. However, it was a perfect fit here. June Brigman was the co-creator of Power Pack with Louise Simonson, and set the very realistic, very finely detailed drawings of the kids. Not easy to draw kids in comic books. Ask John Byrne, ask a whole bunch of really big name comic book creators how hard it is to actually draw kids appropriately that actually look like kids and look like, instead of just midgets crawling over their parents and stuff it is. June Brigman did it well, and John Bogdanove also did it well. Like I said, his art was looser, a little more less structured than Brigman was, but it fit the characters perfectly. He created personality for the characters in every line he drew. This is around a time when Franklin Richards joined the team, or was starting to hang out with the team. And I think Bogdanove, if I'm not mistaken, based the character design of Franklin Richards on his own son. So I believe his son is Kal-El, I believe. So that's, all you guys complain about his Superman work, he's a Superman fan, so get off his back. But while it was looser, Simonson kind of moved the narrative to that. There's space aliens. One space alien kind of looked like Whoopi Goldberg. There was a whole bunch of monsters that they had to fight that were scary looking, but still goofy enough not to be nightmare inducing for the kids who are reading the book. I think he really shined as taking over in this aspect, and had really big shoes to fill in, because taking over the original creator is never a fun job, no matter how thin you slice it. Next up, Rick Holberg replaces Jerry Ordway in All-Star Squadron number 31. Jerry Ordway was involved with All-Star Squadron almost from the very beginning. I don't think he might not have worked on every issue, but he provided inks over Adrian Gonzalez's artwork and Rich Buckler's artwork. He provided unity of tone for a while until he actually took over the pencils. But when he took over the pencils, they were fantastic. His artwork, in my opinion, he's one of my favorite artists of all time. Maybe second or third. He's in the top 5. But his artwork meshed with the Golden Age characters perfectly. It was better artwork, more finely detailed, and prettier artwork than most of the characters got in their World War II heyday. But it had enough kind of like classic feel to it that it felt separated from the John Burns and the Frank Millers and the George Perez's around the world and stuff like this. It seemed to have like a classic feel that felt at place in a comic book about characters who were created 40 years before he actually took place in this. And his work on All-Star Squadron helped make it one of my favorite books of all time. So when he announced his leaving, well, I was more than concerned. I was very troubled. But however, His first immediate successor was an artist by the name of Rick Holberg. Rick Holberg was not a stranger to comic books. He had certain a history of drawing comic books. He wasn't a rookie. He was an experienced veteran, but he had enough of the similar kind of classic style to Ordway. It wasn't a direct copy. It was totally different, but the same fine line, the same kind of like blocky figures, very simplistic in delivery, but still yet very detailed. Not over rendered, but then again, giving enough detail to get the story across. That it wasn't a seamless transition, but it was much more seamless than some of the artists that came in to replace Holberg were. It wasn't a massive drop off in quality, as we would see later on in the series. It was a continuance of the guard, and it lasted for as long as Holberg was on the series. And it for me as a fan of this, a big fan of this series when it happened, I was able to, like, it still hurt to see Jerry Ordway gone, but having Rick Holberg taking up the reins helped ease the pain just a little bit. Next up, Kelly Jones replacing Jackson Guice on the Micronauts. These are the case of two legendary creators working on a mid-tier or lower-tier comic book, and two artists who I imagine do not have, in my opinion, get the respect or admiration that they deserve. And here they are, early on in their career, one replacing the other. Of course, Micronauts was inspired by the Hasbro toy line. I believe at the time, I think it was maybe Tomy. It eventually became under the ownership of Hasbro, as a lot of other toy lines did, which Marvel adapted as being a Visions of the sub-universe. It's a microscopic universe that exists in, like, underneath our universe, that you have to shrink really small to go down to actually visit it. I believe it was written by Bill Mantlo, and I believe Jackson Guice cut his teeth on the title, and that's where he made his name for himself, with a very kind of sleek, very polished kind of presentation. He was very equally as good as drawing the human characters. I believe he might have actually taken over for Michael Golden too, so that's another replacement there. But he was also very good at, like, drawing the mechanical characters, their suits of armor as well. When Kelly Jones took over the artwork, Kelly Jones has a radically divergent style than Jackson Guice. Very moody, very gothic, very using darks and exaggerated figures and stuff like this. However, he was able to, his artwork, while totally different from Jackson Guice, fit the concept. It fit the concept of Micronauts, who are weird and outlandish and outside and not really, like, not normal, not as compared to, like, Spider-Man or Captain America. So him taking over there was a kind of a radical change, but one that actually, I believe, worked. Of course, Kelly Jones went on to work for Batman and Deadman, and his very outlandish kind of, like, artwork really fit those characters. Jackson Guice, also known as Butch Guice, became, like, one of the best artists in there. Very realistic, sometimes photorealistic, working on Superman, working on Ruse for CrossGen. Did a whole bunch of artwork, and he passed earlier this year. May he rest in peace. But to have two really underrated comic book artists on the same title, following each other, that's a pretty good accomplishment, I think. Next up, Keith Giffen being replaced by Steve Lightley on Legion of Superheroes number 3. This is the Baxter series. If you're talking about comic book creating teams of the 80s, you have Byrne, Claremont, you have Wolfman Perez on New Teen Titans, and you have Paul Levitz and Keith Giffen on the Legion of Superheroes. Legion of Superheroes, which, you know, a lot of people here who are not oldest to remember when they were actually popular on the newsstand, were was DC Comics arguably their second most popular comic book series of the time. Back in the 80s, it was New Teen Titans and Legion of Superheroes. Maybe not in sales because Batman and Superman always sold no matter what, but for excitement and popular reviews amongst the fan community and having a lot of love from a lot of comic book readers and collectors, those were the main two things that come out of DC Comics that were very, 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 very well to helping them compete with Marvel, and on both a popularity standpoint and a quality standpoint. But however, the pair of Levitz and Giffen were known as being like the team for the Legion of Superheroes. They worked for quite a while, but eventually, again, things happen, things change. I think this one was a scene ahead of time because I believe Giffen did a couple of the breakdowns. Breakdowns, in case you don't know, and I might do a segment on this, is kind of when comic book a penciler, instead of doing detailed pencils, just like stick figures or loose figures and stuff like this, to show where he wants the characters placed, and then he gives it to the inker or another penciler to finish the job. So I did this first time on a couple of issues of when Lightly took over, but Steve Lightly was another artist who left us too soon, may he rest in peace, was kind of a shock to the system compared to Giffen. Giffen had a kind of a dark, kind of like scratchy kind of art style, inspired by, I believe, Brazilian and South American comic book artists of the day. Set him apart from practically everybody else in the comic book industry. Steve Lightly was more of a kind of like in line of, say, Michael Golden or as I mentioned earlier, Butch Guice, kind of a slick, sleek, kind of like a step above the typical bland, boring comic book artistry, yes, but more a conventional artist than Giffen was at the time. So you wouldn't expect it to actually work that well. Luckily, he came in on the thing doing like a fundamental storyline of the Legion of Superheroes, the Baxter series. Actually, the issue came in is the famous issue where Karate Kid sacrifices his life to save his adopted home planet of Orlando and his wife, Princess Projecta. It was a powerful, powerful book, and it kind of gave a showcase to him. Most people probably would have like been daunted to have that their first book on a series, but it was the best thing for him because it showed him like he could actually do the actual artwork. He could portray emotion as well as Giffen, and different style, but and granted working from Giffen's breakdowns, but the title will be in good hands now that it's been passed over to from Keith Giffen to Steve Lightly. So it was another great replacement in comic book history. Next up is Erik Larsen being replaced by Mark Bagley on Amazing Spider-Man 345. This book has had a lot of great creators replacing other great creators. We'll get to who Erik Larsen replaced in a little bit of a couple seconds, so hold tight on that. I believe Erik Larsen left us around this time because it's about the time that Image was starting up. So they're looking for a replacement. Erik Larsen, as you know, has a very distinctive style, very, very kind of angular, very kind of like all his own. Kind of hard to describe it compared to anybody else. It is compared to, I compare it to like say like kind of like a marriage of say Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld. Funny I should mention that first one, hint hint. And say maybe Art Adams. It's kind of a fine line, but kind of like distinctive, unique, all his own kind of artwork. We could work it with a superhero comic, make it recognized to anybody, but you could also tell it's his style. Replacing him with Mark Bagley was a bold choice, I think. Mark Bagley, I think, at this time had very limited experience in comic books. I think he became into the world of comic books because through the, if I'm not mistaken, the Marvel Try It Out book. It was a oversized Treasury side book where you could actually practice your artwork or your inking and send it to Marvel, and they'll give you critiques on it and tell you what to do and stuff like this. It's I think they came out two versions of it. One was in the 80s, one was in the 90s. But I think Mark Bagley came up to that. His most famous work before this, I believe, was on Strike Force Morituri. He took over, I believe, for Brent Anderson, another big kind of like fill-in thing that I don't think made the list. However, he was more of a classical artist, more of a fine line kind of like artist thing there. Didn't have as much like flair or like definitive thing as Erik Larsen, but he had his own style that worked well for him. He took to Amazing Spider-Man like a duck to water. He drew hundreds of issues of this, not just the Amazing Spider-Man title, but also the Ultimate Spider-Man title, which he, as I mentioned earlier, as one of the great pairings of writer and artist, he did over 100 issues of that title with Brian Michael Bendis. He became known as the Spider-Man artist, and his artwork was beautiful and very detailed, very fine line, very, very expressive. But it also had a kind of like a style all its own, and a different style than Larsen. And thankfully, Marvel didn't decide to do like they did with a whole bunch of other books that the Image creators were on, and try to force Bagley to try to ape Erik Larsen, because that probably ended Bagley's career, and instead Bagley became one of the most famous Spider-Man artists of all time, in my opinion. Number 4. Remember when I told you about Todd McFarlane and keep track of Erik Larsen? The next replacement I thought really worked out really well was Todd McFarlane being replaced by Erik Larsen on Amazing Spider-Man, which happened on issue number 379, and on the Adjectiveless Spider-Man series that was created exclusively for Todd McFarlane, which replaced him on number 18. This is a case of like finding somebody who has a similar style, not so much actually physically, line for line, but in spirit. Todd McFarlane is one of my favorite artists. I think he's one of the most inventive and, genre-breaking and boundary-breaking artists in comic books today. Even though he doesn't do much artwork today, because he doesn't really have to, because he has more money than Paraguay. But his way of framing a shot, framing a page, creating a visual design of the panels on the page, was something that comic books never seen before, and doesn't really see it all that often now. But he kind of broke the boundaries, broke the bonds, and he got rewarded for it by becoming one of the most hottest artists of the time, of all time, as a matter of fact, because of it. But when he was left at Amazing Spider-Man to actually go over to his own book that he was writing and drawing, he kind of left a big, big hole on the Amazing Spider-Man book, one that was ably filled by Erik Larsen. Erik Larsen had a similar kind of unique style, different from McFarlane, but you could see certain traces of DNA in both. They're both kind of like very, very loose and fluid with their characters. And when you're doing a character that floats from building to building on a string of webbing, having fluidity in your artwork really helps. But again, once Image started knocking around and Todd McFarlane started to consider about possibly bailing, Erik Larsen chose to picking up on the Spider-Man book, and he was given, I believe, the opportunity to write and draw a series of it. I believe it involved the Secret Six, or the Sinister Six, coming back together. And I remember this having crossovers from practically every hot Marvel comic book character they were publishing there. Deathlock, Darkwing, Darkhawk, I should say. Darkhawk, Wolverine, all of them, all going from issue to issue through the whole thing, as he kind of went through all the bad guys that made up there. I think one of the bad guys was Gog, was a monster that was in the Savage Land that Spider-Man faced off against in an issue of his book back then. So that's how deep Erik Larsen dived for this, and how much respect he had for the characters. Eventually, of course, he would also leave Marvel and start up Savage Dragon for Image. So, but for a brief period of time, he did stand in for his co-owner on Spider-Man, two Spider-Man series, and provided a nice seamless transition from the superstar artist McFarlane into whoever took over next for him. Next up, number 3 on my list, if you're keeping track, we're down to the top 3. This is another case like where there's a little gap between the thing, but for me, a big, important transfer over is Adam Hughes taking over for Kevin Maguire on the Justice League International. Maguire left Justice League International at issue number 23. There are fill-in issues by Ty Templeton and Bill Willingham, excellent artists. Ty Templeton did a bunch of fill-ins for this, and they're all very great. However, he only was there for like an issue or two and before he moved on. The next regular artist is Adam Hughes. Adam Hughes took over with 31, so it was a kind of a gap of about 8 issues before he took over, and he stayed on the book until issue number 44. However, this is like one of the reasons why it made Justice League and Justice League International and Justice League America. The titles of this book is daffy and unnecessary and confusing, but that's a topic for another time. I should probably cover it in my whole volumes series. But however, the success of the series was, of course, by J.M. DeMatteis and also Keith Giffen on writing. They did very well with creating a wahaha style of humor in the book, which was good, but also could be deadly serious at times when it needed to be. And they meshed both well. I remember the first Millennium tie-in was where the Manhattan robots, took over Rocket Red, and he's inside the Beetlebug airship, and he's trying to kill everybody inside, and everybody flying outside is like wondering what's going on. I thought that was very well done. The menace and threat was provided very well, but there's also, very, very funny gags involved in it. But the reason why it works so well, I think, is because they had Kevin Maguire from the first issue on the series to try to make it work. He had beautiful, finely detailed artwork, but his bread and butter, his forte, his strongest point, his gold standard was his facial expressions. And if you're doing a comedy book where a lot of stuff has to do with reactions and getting a point across what characters are thinking without them actually saying it out loud, having somebody who could do faces as well as Kevin Maguire did came in handy. 90%, I would say 80% of the characterization of his characters were on the faces, or not just faces, their body posture, their stances, the way they reacted. Like it's a whole thing that he created that was like so great and so a perfect fit for the Justice League title, the humor and the seriousness of it. So when he took over, when he left, having somebody to take over and do this, they had big shoes to fill. It was kind of like a case with like the kind of like, there wasn't really anybody else in comic books that really had that kind of good at being facial expressions. Maybe George Perez, but George Perez, you're not going to get him to take over a Justice League book. He's busy doing his own stuff, and you probably wouldn't be able to afford him. Anyhow, so they went to the indie route and got a young artist who was most known for doing the artwork on an independent comic book called Mage Agency, and brought him in. This is arguably, I think, I don't think I know, and if you want to challenge me on it and be wrong, tell me in the comments if you want to. This made Adam Hughes Adam Hughes. This was his big break. This exposed him to a whole bunch of other people that probably wouldn't have seen his artwork before if he was still doing independent books. He obviously, as we all know, draws a very pretty woman with voluptuous stuff on them, but he's also very good at doing the facial expressions. Not as good as Maguire, but still good to get the point across. But he had more of a slick kind of like excellent use of shadows, less kind of like detailed and more kind of like atmospheric and emotional and evocative kind of artwork. But it fit. It fit the concept great. It fit the comic book great. It fit the narrative great. It fit everything great. But like I said, he didn't stay there long, and obviously became one of the most important cover artists in the entire world. I did a whole rundown of the top 10 cover artists of all time. You might want to check that out. It's on the channel someplace. But it if he kind of dropped the ball or screwed the pooch on this one, he might not have had that heights. This is one of my favorite series when I was collecting it, and I was like, personally like, all right, come on, let's see what you got. And it didn't take him long for him to warm up to him and him to win me over. A very good, strong artwork by a relatively young Adam Hughes. You should try to check it out. Like there's omnibuses and there's trade paperbacks of his artwork then, and you'll be able to see his development as an artist on this like year of work on Title. It's probably fun to see if you're a big fan of his cover work, to see where he got started and him doing sequential artwork and stuff like that. Very, very, very good replacement for Kevin Maguire. The next two, the top two, I'm cheating just a little bit. One is completely outside of, one is partially outside of my collecting aspect. It happened during the time I was reading comic books, but I wasn't really collecting this book, if you will. And the first one happened years before I was born, so I can't even claim that I was inspired by that, but I can't have this list without not having that number one. So hold on to your shorts and call me Shirley. Let's get going with these two. Just want to give you a little warning about that. Number two, I have John Byrne replacing Dave Cockrum on Uncanny X-Men. Arguably, this is like one of the most historic changing of the guards ever. Dave Cockrum is not a bad artist. He's a great artist, and he's the guy who ushered in the era of new X-Men in, and he's the once and future artist on the X-Men. He, I think, replaced Byrne on the Title and he had like a couple like issues in between when Byrne left and Paul Smith took over. So he wasn't a bad artist. He was a great artist. He's a great artist for the Title. Created all the characters, had like created their costumes, their look, their design, everything about them. But if you stayed on the book, I don't know if it would actually be as big as it is. I don't know if we'd be having like movies and movies and movies and having like people getting excited because there's going to be a new installment of the Marvel characters in the MCU. I don't know if we'd have like 50,000 X titles with every mutant underneath the sun getting their own time in like at least a 10-issue miniseries to show how great they are. Without John Byrne taking over. John Byrne and Chris Claremont created something magical. And I feel sad by saying this because, like I said, Cockrum was awesome. He wasn't just solid, he was good. He was great. He was great for the characters. He created he created Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is one of the most interesting looks for any comic book character in the history of comic books. He created Colossus, another very good designed character. He created him. He was good at causing their expressions and their personality coming through on the artwork. So, like, just giving all the flowers to John Byrne, I feel bad because it's not like Dave Cockrum was bad, but as I said, Chris Claremont and John Byrne had something really good going together. Of course, they worked with each other many times before John Byrne came over on Uncanny X-Men. I believe they had a pretty good run, if I'm not mistaken, on, say, the Marvel Team-Up series. They also had a couple issues of the Luke Cage series, especially towards the end when it started turning over to from Luke Cage Here for Hire to Power Man and Iron Fist. They also, I think, worked on Iron Fist a little bit. So they had a history of working together, and they have already developed the synergy before they both became involved together on Uncanny X-Men, but John Byrne, and probably has less to do with his artwork, which was fantastic, which was beautiful, which was powerful and iconic, but more about his attitude as a co-plotter and a co-writer on this. He developed a lot of stuff with this series and stuff like this. And if you look during his tenure there, what they had, to deal with, they had the Hellfire Club, they introduced Dazzler, they introduced Kitty Pryde, the Days of Future Past, the Dark Phoenix saga, a extended period of some of the most iconic and most memorable, most historic X-Men titles and storylines that there ever was, and without which the title probably might not have survived. It might not have grown out of the morass of possibly being canceled as it was before the new X-Men was introduced, and who knows what we might be like looking forward to in the MCU these days. Maybe the Inhumans movie or something like this. But it took John Byrne to replace Dave Cockrum to light the afterburners and take the X-Men into a new level, and to where it is one of Marvel's best-selling, most interesting concepts even to this day, and you have John Byrne and Chris Claremont to thank for that. My number one best replacement of all time is, and if you're savvy, you probably already realize this, is John Romita Jr. replacing Steve Ditko on Amazing Spider-Man number 34. I believe it was 34. It might have been 39. If you're talking about characters defined by their artists, the early Spider-Man was defined by Steve Ditko. From the get-go, Spider-Man was not a character who was kind of like every other one. He wasn't like Superman or Batman, who had barrel chests and muscles out the wazoo and towered over people. He was a gawky, awkward teenage boy who got the powers of the spider, but that didn't mean he'd have to be a weightlifter or look like Adonis. He looked weird, spindly, creepy looking almost a little bit. And this is all due to Steve Ditko's interpretation of the character. Famously, Stan Lee offered it to Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby had an idea of like where he wanted to go with the character. I think he wanted to make it out to be like kind of like the Human Fly, which had a kid who had a ring, who turned him into an adult, and he'd fight crime with his web gun and stuff like this. He eventually used it when he did a revamp of the character for Archie Comics with Joe Simon, I believe. But Stan Lee, as the story goes, and take every story from the Silver Age of comic books with a grain of salt the size of Utah, didn't feel that the classic rough and tumble, strong character that Jack Kirby was presenting him was good enough for the character. So he decided to go in a different direction and went with Steve Ditko, who also was working at Marvel at the time, working on monster projects, and caught magic in a bottle. Would Spider-Man have made it as big a hit if it was anybody else doing the artwork? I would say probably not. Having Ditko do Spider-Man created a diversity in the Marvel comic universe. Granted, yes, for years to come, even after he left the comic book company, Stan Lee had Jack Kirby be used as the inspiration for all the artists that came after him. John Buscema, Rich Buckler, Sal Buscema. You could see Jack Kirby and all those artists. Even some people tried, like Don Heck tried and didn't really pay off and stuff like this. He was the house style for Marvel Comics, but having Steve Ditko on Spider-Man proved that we're not going to be homogenized. We're not going to be the same. We're going to try some things. We're going to do some different things, and also kind of this helped when Neil Adams came over and his more realistic art style took over, and he kind of was able to play in the field, and Jim Steranko as well. However, Steve Ditko and Stan Lee did not get along. definitely during the end of their tenure together. There are many stories about this being combative, and it got like basically, you know, Steve Ditko had to fight for the credit of co-plotter, which he eventually did get on the actual titles, but he was constantly fighting and kind of like squabbling with Lee about the directions he wanted to go. I remember reading in a Alter Ego magazine, detailing about how one of the things that broke the back of the relationship between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko is that he wanted the Green Goblin to be an anonymous guy, somebody off the street that Spider-Man never met, had anything to do with, or anything like that. Stan Lee wanted him to be Norman Osborn because he thought it'd be more shocking and more emotionally powerful and stuff. This, it went back and forth, and as we all know, who won that argument. And so a lot of people say like the artists were responsible for everything that happened in Marvel Comics. I use that as an example that, yeah, as long as you didn't cross, Stan Lee, and you'll find out exactly who is the boss at that time. That's a discussion for another video I'm probably going to do in this segment. However, he eventually, the relationship became so tenuous. He wasn't even talking to Stan Lee. He got his instructions from him through a third party. Tried to came into the office when he wasn't there, or if he was there, he ignored him. He didn't go to his stuff like this, and eventually it became like he just gave up and he left the title, which is kind of ballsy, leaving the best-selling comic book in all comic books, second maybe only to Superman and Batman, and just saying, "I'm peace out. I'm done. I can't take this anymore. You do you, and I'll do me over here at another company called Charlton, and I'll come back in the 80s when you're long gone out in Hollywood, trying to get movies that'll never be made." But this left a big hole, a big gap in Spider-Man because, again, the artist that defined Spider-Man left. And of course, I believe like this caused a lot of consternation at the time. But I don't know if John Romita Jr. was art director at the time. He eventually did become art director, but he was a solid artist. He was working on Daredevil. He did a couple issues of Daredevil before this, including one crossover with Spider-Man, which, kind of seen it by a lot of people nowadays as a ipso facto tryout book for the main Spider-Man series. He was tapped to take over for Steve Ditko, and for a while, like you could see, like in the artwork, like where he was given the, like kind of like maybe the instructions of like, I'm not going to tell you to copy Steve Ditko, but you should copy Steve Ditko. There's a lot of similarities before then, but again, like his style wasn't the same as Steve Ditko. It wasn't as, I'm saying loose and fluid, and like more emotive and more, I want to say cartoony, but yeah, I guess that fits. It kind of like not quite as realistic as Romita's was. The characters were he was more of a traditional comic book artist. He made his bones in romance books for DC Comics in the 50s. And again, he was good at doing superheroes and the big brawny superheroes. So he took over the series with a totally different style. And like even though they tried to meld the styles together just a little bit, it was still, you could still can't keep them down. And if, say, like, the fans didn't respond to it, he might have been forced to become an exact Steve Ditko clone. But luckily, people grew to appreciate his artwork. He's really good storyteller, really good delivering action, drew gorgeous female characters. And don't forget, this was the era right around when Gwen Stacy was in the book being like Spider-Man's girlfriend, and his aunt trying to set him up with Mary Jane Watson, who also was not that bad looking. It's a funny scene because like I'll try to put it up here. They have like a picture of Mary Jane in shadow drawn by Steve Ditko underneath the tree, and it's a Steve Ditko woman. It's you could tell it's frumpy. She probably has a house dress on, like plain dress, hair up in like kind of like Betty Brant had, and stuff that's not like really like not face it, Tiger, hit a jackpot thing. It's like, oh, face it, Tiger, you have to settle for me kind of thing. So the one good thing that the change happened is because we probably wouldn't have a as vivacious and boom-vacious Mary Jane Watson, later Mary Jane Parker, without John Romita there. He responsible for making her a character that people wanted to see a whole lot more of, not all for above the board reasons, some more prurient than others. However, his contribution to that is we probably would have, if Steve Ditko was still doing the book and he introduced Mary Jane Watson, we probably wouldn't have her as being Venom today. And yeah, that's maybe not the best analogy to use, but however, that's how it is. So that's my list. Do you have any ones that I left out that I should have included? Who is your favorite replacement? Is it on the list I gave you, the 10 replacements I gave you, or do you have another one? I do have a kind of like a outline for the top 5 worst artist replacements in comic books. If you want to see that, let me know in the comments. I'm trying to keep this as a positive thing, but I know people like this kind of stuff. So if you want to see like who I think are the worst artists to take over for a superstar artist, then let me know and I will tell you them, and hopefully you will not take it too harsh. But if you made this far, again, I thank you very much. Thank you for even like looking at any of this. Although if you bailed in the first 10 minutes, you're not here. So, but thank you. If you did make it this far, throw me a like. It's very good for the YouTube algorithm. It helps get this channel in front of the eyes of many people who might like it, who right now might not know it's out there, because it's I'm still building. But if you can do that, if you want to comment, share if you like this, and subscribe, because I have a whole bunch of content similar to this that I've already made, that is already in our archives, and that is coming down the pike. So yeah, thank you for coming out. Do all that stuff I ask you to, but if you do or you don't, just remember this: just keep on collecting.